Good morning. My name is Miss Lewis, and I'm one of the assistant principals at Wake Village Elementary. Today, Miss Coleman has invited me to your classroom to share one of my favorite stories with you. It's called The Relatives Came. This is such a great book. Today, we're going to talk about making connections. One type of connection we're going to discuss is called text to self. Good readers make text connections. Today we're going to talk about a specific type of connection called text to self. How is something in this story like something that happened to you? Today when we read The Relatives Came, I want you to think about what type of text to self connection you can make. How is something in this story like something that has happened to you before? The relatives came. I hope you enjoyed this story. Your thinking job is to make a text-to-self connection as I read this story. How is something in the story like something that happened to you? It was in the summer of the year when the relatives came. They came up from Virginia. They left when their grapes were nearly purple enough to pick, but not quite. Look at the picture. Notice what they're doing. They're stuffing their car full of all their luggage. They had an old station wagon that smelled like a real car, and in it they put an ice chest full of soda pop and some boxes of crackers and some bologna sandwiches, and up they came from Virginia. They left at 4 in the morning when it was still dark, before even the birds were awake. I remember traveling early in the morning when I would go visit relatives out of town too. They drove all day long and into the night. And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their almost purple grapes back home. They thought about Virginia, but they thought about us too, waiting for them. So they drank up all their pop and ate up all their crackers and traveled up all those miles until finally they pulled into our yard. Have you ever waited outside like the boys and girls in this picture for a relative to pull up? I remember being a little girl sitting outside waiting for my grandparents to drive up, excited to greet them. Then it was hugging time. Talk about hugging. Those relatives just passed us all around their car, pulling us against their wrinkled Virginia clothes, crying sometimes. They hugged us for hours. Why do you think they cried hugging them? Do you think maybe they were excited they hadn't seen each other in a while? This is a great time to make a text-to-self connection. Think about a time you've experienced seeing a family member from out of town. Who was it? Then it was into the house and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You'd have to go through at least 4 different hugs to get from the kitchen to the front room. Those relatives. And finally a big supper, 2 or 3 times around until we all got a turn at the table. There was quiet talk, and we were in 2s and 3s through the house. I remember when we would have family reunions at my grandparents' house, and all of our relatives would come out of town, and this is what our living room would look like, spread out everywhere in every room, eating, talking, laughing, sharing stories. The relatives weren't particular about beds, which was good since there weren't any extras. So a few squeezed in with us and the rest slept on the floor. Some with their arms thrown over the closest person, or some with an arm across one person and a leg across another. It was different going to sleep with all the new breathing in the house. This brings me to a text-to-self connection. I remember having to sleep on the floor at family reunions. We had a great time with our cousins, laughing and giggling. The relatives stayed for weeks and weeks. They helped us tend the garden, and they fixed any broken things they could find. They ate up all of our strawberries and melons, then promised we could eat up all their grapes and peaches when we came to Virginia. I can make another text-to-self connection. The gentleman sitting in the chair playing the banjo, that reminds me of my pawpaw. He would sit in the chair outside with my great aunts and uncles, and they would play instruments, and we would all sit around and listen, and as little kids, we would even dance. But none of us thought about Virginia much. We were so busy hugging and eating and breathing together. What do you think the author means by that, breathing together? How do you think they're all feeling based on the picture of getting to be together and spend time together? Finally, after a long time, the relatives loaded up their ice chests and headed back to Virginia at 4 in the morning. We stood there in our pajamas and waved them off in the dark. We watched the relatives disappear down the road. Then we crawled back into our beds that felt too big and too quiet. We fell asleep. And the relatives drove on all day long and into the night. And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses in different mountains, and they thought about their dark purple grapes waiting at home in Virginia. But they thought about us too, missing them, and they missed us. That's another text-to-self connection I can make. At the end of our family reunions, we'd always be sad when it was time to go home, not knowing when we'd get to see each other again. And then they were finally home in Virginia. They crawled into their silent, soft beds and dreamed about next summer. Now that we've finished our story, it's your turn to make a text-to-self connection. Remember, text-to-self. How is something in this story like something that happened to you? Your assignment today is in your Google Classroom. You're going to make a text-to-self connection using the book The Relative Came. Think about part of the story that you can connect to. You're going to click on the words that say click here, and you're going to type about something from the story that you can make a connection to. Then you're going to come over here and click, and you're going to tell me about that connection, that personal experience that you had. Think about some of the ones that Miss Lewis discussed in the story, The Relatives Came.